This show is listener supported. You can join us and help our show grow to support more adoptees by going to adopteeson.com/partner. You're listening to Adoptees On, the podcast where adoptees discuss the adoption experience. This is episode 152, Matthew. I'm your host, Haley Radke. Matthew Salas is here today, and I'm so thrilled to share our conversation with you. He has a ton of insightful things to share with us. We talk about how coming out of the fog is an act of radicalization. We discuss issues of race and why he's chosen to be so open and vulnerable on Twitter. We also touch on dad jokes and why adoptees often have a darker sense of humor. So much good stuff here. And make sure you stick around to the end of the episode, and I'll let you know how you can win a signed copy of Matthew's brand new book, Disappear, Doppelganger, Disappear. And I want to warn you, we do spoil one storyline of the book. So if you don't want any spoilers, when you hear me ask him a question about, this may be a spoiler, but just jump ahead a couple minutes in the episode and you'll be good to go. Okay, we wrap up with recommended resources, and as always, links to everything we'll be talking about today are on the website adopteeson.com. Let's listen in. I'm so pleased to welcome to Adoptees On, Matthew Salas. Welcome, Matthew.
Hi, thanks for having me.
I am a little bit too excited. I've followed you on Twitter for way too many years that I won't admit. And I'm so, you're just a prolific writer and just such a amazing asset to the adoptee community, especially, I feel like. And so I'm just thrilled to get to introduce you to my listeners today. And I'd love it if you would share some of your story with us.
Sure. So I was adopted when I was 2.5 or like 4 months, maybe 2 and 4 months. And I was born in Seoul. I was, according to my file, I was left with a note that had my birthday and said that they should give me to somebody rich. And I was left under an overpass in Seoul. And I think a policeman found me, named me in Korean, and then brought me to an orphanage, or maybe that's not the exact order of events. Maybe brought me to an orphanage and then named me. But I stayed in the orphanage, for 2 years, a little over 2 years, and then was adopted by a white couple in Connecticut. At that time, it was still kind of hands off. So I flew over to JFK with some kind of handler, I'm assuming, having no kind of idea what I was getting into, and also being 2 years old. And my parents picked me up from there, and that's it. Yeah, I guess.
And so did you grow up in Connecticut with other siblings? Did you stay there? What was your growing up with?
I grew up in Connecticut. Both of my siblings are adopted from Korea as well. They were both born in Busan, though, and not in Seoul, and were not blood related. My sister was adopted a year after me, but she was adopted as an infant. So she's actually 3.5 years younger than me. My brother was adopted 2 years after that. So we're 5 and change apart. We grew up in Storrs, Connecticut, which is where the University of Connecticut is, which I'm sure is probably somewhat different now, but really depends on the university for everything. They would shut down restaurants and bars when the students weren't there. So over the summer, people couldn't go and drink, or certain restaurants were closed too. That also meant a lot of this was in the 80s, so there wasn't really any diversity. But if there was any diversity, it came from university kids, so kids of university professors. The town I grew up in was super white. I would say must have been 98% white. We had 1 or 2 African-American students, and then there were maybe 4 or 5 other Asian-American kids. And my high school was, I think it was about 500 people for 4 grades. So our grade was maybe 120, 130 people for 3 towns. At the time when I was growing up, I really thought that I was in the suburbs. I guess I didn't really know what the suburbs were like, but I realize now that I grew up in like a rural town. The next town over had more goats than people, but it just never crossed my mind. I thought like, oh, it must be like rural over there, but in our town, it's the suburbs.
Mm.
But clearly it wasn't.
That's so funny. Our perspectives when we're kids, right? When we don't know what we don't know, I guess.
Yeah.
Curious about growing up with other siblings who were adopted. So were those the only other adoptees you knew?
My parents had actually adopted from Korea after they found out they couldn't have kids, and they knew somebody. I had a friend in Ohio who had adopted from Korea, and so they just kind of asked. That was all they knew about adoption, so they just kind of asked how their friends had done it and followed the same steps, which at the time were very easy, I think. So I knew those adoptees, and we would kind of get together as a group every summer. They had a house on a lake in Maine where they would spend summers, and so we would go up and visit them. My siblings and I did not talk about adoption at all, so adoption was really like a very taboo subject in my house. What we were told was just the kind of basic bare, not even the facts of the adoption, but sort of just, your parents gave you up and we adopted you and we're family now, and you guys are just like us. So my parents practiced rejection of difference, to use, I guess, the psychological term. At the time they thought the best thing was pretend there's no such thing as race and act as if we were birth children. Though at other times, right, like I remember sometimes when I would hear, like if we were in trouble or something, right, we would say, or I would say, like, you're not my real parents. And my parents would say stuff like, well, if you were, in Korea, you'd be like a child prostitute or something. Probably not in those exact terms, but that's basically how I interpret it in my head.
Yikes.
Yeah, so I was like, fine, I'll go back to Korea. And they'd be like, go. And I was like, oh, no, actually, I'm way too scared to go back to Korea because you just told me that I would be like living on the streets and having sex for money. So I was really terrified of Korea. I knew nothing about it, right? Because in the 80s, there was just nothing Korean here. There were no Korean restaurants, no Korean movies in the States, like no K-pop. There was that stuff in Korea, obviously, but not here. So, and I grew up in a really small town. So the only thing I had in terms of like Asian anything was like a American Chinese restaurant, which we went to sometimes, and a Taiwanese friend whose house I went to after school, which actually was really great for me. It was the only time I got to eat like real rice and be at all around anything Asian.
So I have seen you reference adoption in all kinds of ways in not all of your essays, but lots of your essays and writing and things online. And I'm curious for you, when adoption, like I'm adopted, kind of started to be on your radar or like something you actually thought about, or was it just like something you kind of were pushing to the side and didn't really want to address?
I grew up obviously knowing that I was adopted and like having that around all the time. It was impossible to forget that I was adopted because other people were always pointing it out, right? So like if we went anywhere in public, other kids at school, at the time, like adopted was an insult. I don't know if it still is. I hope not. And so like that was just something that I had to deal with all the time. So there was never really like out of my mind what I was kind of pushing back into the recesses of identity was the fact that I wasn't white. So like I didn't really push away adoption because I just couldn't. But my parents would treat us all as if we all had the same privileges. And so what I did kind of try to bury was the fact that I looked different from them and that led to different treatment from other people. I remember, there was just kind of a moment, I can't remember how old I was, maybe like 7 or 8, looking in the mirror and just realizing like, oh, you're like, in my head, I would see myself as white. Like if you have those moments when you like kind of float up in the air and look down on yourself. I always saw myself as like a white kid down there who looked like his parents. And then still sometimes I can, it's hard to kind of put myself into my own imagination. But I remember this time looking into the mirror and thinking like, well, crap, I'm not white, right? Like this is not actually what I'm seeing here, and having to deal with that. So that was the big kind of denial part of it. Adoption was always just a kind of fact of life for me.
So we talk a lot about coming out of the fog, so to speak. And for most people that use that term, it sort of means, when did you realize that adoption also meant a loss of your first family? Because most of us grew up, just hearing from all these people how lucky we were to be adopted, and weren't our adoptive parents great for saving us, etc., whatever version of that you got. But do you identify with that phrase? Do you think that's something that you've experienced?
Yes, it is. It's like radicalization, right? It's realizing that you live in a different world than you thought you lived in. And yes, I mean, I definitely had that experience. It was just, race was such like a much larger part of how people were reading me, and it was, even anything adoption related was always tied into race, that was kind of at the front of the battle lines for people. And I always felt kind of attacked by race first. And so that coming out of the fog was more racial for me. Adoption, the loss of adoption, I guess I've always felt that. And maybe it's different for my siblings. I wonder if it is different for my siblings. I wonder if it's different if you're adopted younger. But I guess I've always felt the loss there, even when it was a kind of unnameable loss. Though I probably mostly just associated it with the birth mother. It's funny how like the birth mother becomes like the figure that stands in for all of the different losses that are involved. And so I had this kind of idea that one, that she had like hated me and rejected me and didn't want me. And then one, that she, loved me very much and had done what she thought was best for me. I didn't know any of the details from my file at that time. So I actually had not known anything except for the fact, I think my parents told me that I was left at the steps of an orphanage. So not exactly the same thing. But so I in my head, I thought maybe I should just drop there or something. And the Korean adoption files are often, how do I say this gently? Lies. So,
well, I noticed when you were sharing the story, you're like, this is what my file says.
Yeah.
Or the other thing is,
so I don't actually know at all what happened.
We always hear the files are lost in fire or flood. That's the other theme. So.
Oh yes, I got the fire thing too. Mm-hmm. The orphanage had burned down, I was told. Before I was old enough to have heard a lot of other stories and to have known that this is a common story. So I just kind of took it at face value.
Did you ever think about searching?
I have searched. I mean, that's why, right? That's how I know about my file and the orphanage probably not burning down. And I went, my wife, who died a couple of years ago, is Korean, and I met her in Korea, and I had gone, this was like 2006, I think 2006. I moved to Busan to teach English, and I had all these kind of excuses set up for myself, like, oh, I'm not going to search at all. That's why I'm going to Busan, right? Like, I'm not even going to Seoul. I just want to like see what it's like. I knew nothing about Korea. And so when I arrived in Busan, I had like a really awful experience. I can say more about it later maybe, but my wife kind of was there for me during a really hard time. And we started dating right away, and she really helped me acclimate to Korean culture in a way that I thought in my head, I thought would be like a natural, you smell the air, you like touch the ground, and like everything comes back. I mean, because I was 2.5, right? So there must have been some memories somewhere, though I don't have them consciously. But she offered to, do the translating and kind of look through channels that are available in Korean and that I wouldn't have been able to access in English. And so she and I went to Seoul to visit the adoption agency on the Korean side. And we met with an agent on the Korean side, and she showed me the file, told me the orphanage had burned down, wouldn't let me make any photocopies or anything. Though I remember pretty strongly. There was a lot actually about like PTSD, my dad having PTSD and stuff. And then we went and we visited the overpass. I looked at the place where I was supposedly left. I had this thought, like maybe I was looking at a specific place and thinking maybe that's where I was left. So now I wonder whether any of that is true or not. I think sometimes the problem with searching for me is that like when you have the time to search, you're often too young to know what you're doing. Or maybe that was just the case for me, but I didn't have a lot of resources. There are a lot more resources now, thankfully. I didn't have that much. I didn't know any other adoptees except for the ones my parents knew. And I was deathly afraid of like offending my parents, being kind of disowned twice. And then, so I didn't know anything about like what I should take as truth and what I should not take as truth. And I gave up very quickly. I mean, I accepted that there was no search to be made, even though that probably isn't the case now. But now I have no time to actually right? No time, no freedom, no money. I've got kids and a job and stuff. And it's hard actually much harder now to do the search. And I wish I had known at the time, right, that I could have done it a lot better.
Yeah, I think a lot of us kind of go in blind and just don't really. I appreciate you saying there are so many more resources now, and it's so true. And there's so many other Korean adoptees who have searched and have like plowed through the nonsense. I really enjoyed Palimpsest. I don't know if have read that graphic memoir, but she goes through her search in Korea and just the frustration level. And it's really fascinating. So that's a great resource.
No, I haven't. I'll have to check that one out.
Oh yeah. It's wonderful. I'm okay. I have too many questions for you. There's not enough time. Well, you have a brand new novel out, Disappear, Doppelganger, Disappear. And I don't think this is a spoiler because I've heard you talk about it in some other interviews, but yourself kind of shows up as a character, except that you are white. And I'm curious about that choice. Can you talk a little bit about that? It's not necessarily you per se, but it's your namesake.
Yeah, so it's totally a spoiler, but everybody keeps bringing it up anyway. So I'm like, well, it's fine.
Oh God! Well, maybe we shouldn't.
No, it's okay. It's it is all out because I get asked this question a lot. But then I think, should I talk about it? Because it's like near-ish the end of the book.
I know.
But no, let's just talk about it.
Okay.
The book is about like the murder of the self and the ways in which the self is killed off, / we kill ourselves off in order to become somebody more acceptable to society. And when I started the book, it was actually called The Murder of the Doppelganger. And I wanted it to be a kind of murder mystery where at the beginning, the narrator would find out that his double had been murdered, and then he would try to figure out what had happened. And then by the end, he would discover that he had killed his doppelganger in this like other world. So that didn't work out exactly because I ruined the murder mystery part of it and turned it into like a super literary novel. But what I did kind of keep was, right, it's still the same basic questions that are being asked, like what happens to the self in disappearance kind of played a much larger role by the end of it than murder per se. Though I still include a chapter that's called The Murder of the Doppelganger, just for myself. I feel like put a lot of jokes in for myself, but that nobody else cares about. That's all a long way of saying when I got to the point where I had to insert this other character, at the time, like in the first drafts, in the early drafts, his name was Walter Parsons. And I was just looking for a name that kind of symbolically represented a person, right? Like my confirmation name. It's been so long since. Is this when you get a name in Catholicism? Confirmation maybe is Walther, and so I put Walter, and then it seemed like a more normal name, and then Parsons was just because it sounded like person. But when I was revising it, I thought, well, like, this actually is very personal, and it's kind of a cop out to pretend that it's not personal and that like I don't actually have skin in the game, which I do. And so if I was to think using this question and theme, thinking like, who is the murderer of me? Then it's like a white me, right? It's like a more acceptable me. So like a white model minority me, or not, model majority, I guess, me. So that's why I named it after my name, because I wanted to kind of show that the novel is not kind of like a contained thing that doesn't affect the actual world, and that in the real world, right, we're living these stories all the time, and the kind of disappearance of the self has real world actual effects and consequences.
And I love the theme of doppelganger, especially looking through the lens of adopted people. And you mentioned, what is it, superposition? And
Yeah.
I've always thought of it like the multiverse. I don't know if those are like similar or that's on the same kind of theme, I guess. But how adoptees, we could have been living this other life had we been with our original families in some fashion. And then you go on to have, it's not just that initial, but it's not the initial decision or separation from our family, but then every little choice like could branch off and have this other, well, I'll call it universe. But I don't know if you can talk about that specific to the adoptee experience, because most of our listeners are adoptees. And just seeing that kind of play out in a really interesting way, just that keeps me thinking about your book long after I've read it.
Yeah, the multiverse thing. I felt the same way as you, right? That adoption is a kind of parallel universe life, in that, there's another you out there living this other life, right? For me, that's always felt really close by, as if it's like, I used to have this feeling, and it's really strong. Like as soon as I suffer a loss, whenever I suffer a loss, it feels as if like the other time, or like the thing right before you do something that you regret, or something happens in a loss kind of occurs, is really just like paper thin away, right? That like if you could just kind of cross some invisible border, and you could be back in the time where you hadn't done that terrible thing, or when like, when my wife hadn't died, or like, where I wasn't kind of left somewhere, wherever that was. I can't imagine that anyone does that without kind of having a lot of regret. And I feel a lot of sympathy for birth mothers and like the difficulty of that decision, whether it's sometimes it's not a decision at all, but still I'm sure there's plenty of loss and regret there. And if it were me, I would always feel, right, that same thing that I feel now too, like the kind of the split between the life that I'm in and the life that seems so close by that I would have had or could have had if I, just a tiny little thing had changed, right? I mean, like a tiny thing that's actually a huge thing, but has a small difference in terms of like, on that day you step outside and it's raining, and so you decide to go back inside, and then you feel like, okay, maybe I won't do it, or whatever. The multiverse, I'm really interested in this idea that, right, like that we actually live all of these different lives at once. And I don't even care if it's like a true scientific thing or not, though it does seem to be. I care about the kind of the truth of the feeling of that. I think that we feel that all the time. And as adoptees, kind of really exceedingly so. The superposition, which I think is really interesting, is the idea that it's not a kind of either or, right? That you don't either live the life in which you're adopted or the life in which you're not adopted, but you're in the superposition, you're doing both at once. So it comes from this scientific fact in which, right, light is both a particle and a wave at the same time, and that if you set up this experiment where there's these slits in the paper and the light and like one photon of light passes through, or one electron or whatever passes through, then if you are measuring it as a particle, right, going in a straight line, then it will go in a straight line and it will hit the paper exactly where the slit is on the other side. And if you're measuring it as a wave, it will actually go through it in a wave pattern, and most of the particles, most of the photons will gather in the center between the slits where it couldn't gather if it were, a straight line. And so those things are happening simultaneously. And one of the really interesting mysteries of it is like what observation has to do with it. Why, like, if we are measuring for one thing, we get one thing, and if we measure for another thing, we get another thing, when both are actually happening at the same time. Like, we ourselves cannot like experience the superposition, but the superposition is a thing that is happening. And so that's really interesting to me to think we are living that other life. We just can't, like, because we are thinking of ourselves in this life, and because, like, we've gathered these experiences and memories and so forth, then we can't actually like experience what it's like in that other life, but it's there all the time. And I do feel like it's presence. It's like, I think sometimes when you talk about the loss of it, it's like not really just a loss in the past, right? It's like a constant presence of absence, a ghost, or right, like a kind of negative image that's always there. That's how I feel it, at least. And that spoke to me a lot in terms of like its relation or similarity to the superposition.
That's so fascinating. Like, that's something that you could just spend days thinking about, right? I mean, oh my goodness. Wow.
I have spent a long time thinking about it.
I'm sure. I was just reading a tweet the other day, and I wish I had printed it out so that I could give credit, but the author was talking about how writing a book, it's not just sitting down and writing, it's all the other things you're doing while you're writing, like you're reading other books and you're researching and just sitting thinking about superpositions. She didn't say that, but I can imagine, because you've been working on this book for a number of years, and I love. Okay, well, let's go to the funny part, because I've seen you talk about how you put in all these funny things in 100-Year Flood, but people didn't seem to think it was funny. And so,
I mean, it's clearly not funny. It's funny to me.
It's funny to
but
you.
Like, you have to kind of know that I've done it.
So then you were like, no, okay, this time we're going to make this book even funnier, so people know it's supposed to be funny. I've heard you talk a little bit about that, but I'm curious if you think there is some link to adoptees trying to find humor in different situations, because sometimes,
like gallows humor.
I mean, yeah, maybe I'm going there, because sometimes I think when a lot of the things we talk about on the show are very real, very deep. We talk about going to therapy. We talk about all these really hard things that adoptees have experienced. And I feel like sometimes we just have to get a sense of humor, because we're, lots of us have depression and have attempted suicide. And, we talk about all those like really, really hard things. But can you talk about how important humor is to you? And I don't know, you have some just like amazing puns and
thank you.
Just delightful little
people
things.
Appreciate the puns. The puns are my favorite.
I was like, this guy's got dad jokes for days. Okay, I'll let you talk about that.
Puns are transformative, right? They're to me, that's the superposition, right? A pun kind of embodies the superposition. It says both the thing that you expect and a totally unexpected thing at the exact same time. It breaks down the kind of set cultural meanings of a word, and it replaces them, at least for a moment, with some kind of transformative humor. I think humor itself is transformative in that way too. It's almost always playing on expectations, right? It's why when we say, like, why did the chicken cross the road to get to the other side? That's only funny if you have like a ton of knowledge about what's going to happen there, right? Like to think first that a joke has to do the unexpected. And so you're setting it up like to think that there's going to be something unexpected there. And then for it to do exactly the normal thing, right, is a breaking of an expectation of unexpectedness, right? So there's like all of these different layers that go on just in a joke like that simple. And in all of that, you're actually thinking about all of these kind of cultural patterns, cultural standards that maybe you don't know you're thinking about, but in order for you to get the joke, right? Even whether you find it funny or not, in order for you to get the joke, you have to be kind of thinking about what our culture has normed as funny, what our culture has normed as not funny, what we expect from jokes and whatever. My son has been telling these knock-knock jokes, but the knock-knock jokes are like, knock, knock, who's there? A dinosaur who? There's a dinosaur on your head, which is like hilarious, but it's only really funny because I know like it's not a good joke, right? Like to him, it's funny it has no reason. Like the knock knock part of it has nothing to do with what he thinks is funny there. What he thinks is funny is just a dinosaur is on your head, right? That's what he thinks is hilarious. But like for me to find it funny, because that's not that funny to me, that you have to think about like how that joke is supposed to go, and then the ridiculousness of it becoming a dinosaur is on your head, right? So each time we use humor in those ways, especially this kind of like dad humor, which I love, and which relies again on like the way that children are kind of being raised into the cultural ways of which we think things are funny, but also kind of aren't totally there, right? That's what makes a dad joke. The dad humor in the book is all kind of pointing towards what I hope is this kind of breakdown of what we think is normal, and like at least some kind of self-awareness of normality or normativity as cultural standards. And in order for Matt Kim, my narrator, to be somebody he recognizes, he first has to really like break down what recognition is, right? And who is recognizing him, and how he's trying to become recognizable in these very cultural ways. And I think of that, also on a kind of word-based level, on a language-based level, that in the language itself are these values, and we have to break them down too. And one of the best ways to do that is humor, or puns specifically, but also like all kinds of humor.
And I think, I love how you addressed language also, because for adoptees, especially if you were adopted out of your country and you lost your connection to your original language, I think that's really significant to think about too.
I'm still waiting for like a really comprehensive study on language reacquirement and adoptees, and I don't think that there is one, but just apocryphally, that's a hard word to say. Apocryphally, it seems it's very difficult for adoptees, transracial, transnational adoptees, to relearn the language that they lost, even if they had been speaking it, right? So for me, I had been speaking it, obviously, before I lost it. But I find it, even though I've lived in Korea multiple times for years total, right, and spoke some like kind of limited Korean at home. My wife was always speaking Korean and speaking to the kids in Korean. I found it extremely difficult to learn like a kind of passable level of Korean. I still don't really have it, even taking lessons and stuff. There's some kind of trauma linked to it. And I would love to, I don't know, I'd be interested at least to see what it looks like in a kind of more scientific study.
Oh my goodness, that would be so interesting. Totally. Okay, so I mentioned before, I follow you on Twitter. You are a great Twitter follow because you are funny and clever, and you're always bringing up these things that I'm learning from you a lot about. But you're also extremely vulnerable, and sometimes sometimes to the point where I think, is he okay? Are things okay? I mean, you've had a rough go of it, like for real. I don't even know how to, just express my condolences to you on the loss of your wife and going through all of her cancer treatments prior. I know a lot of us followed that and, saw all the fundraising, all the things that your community kind of, I feel like, came behind you and her to support you in tangible ways as well. But can you talk about just the vulnerability that you have demonstrated to us? Does that just come natural to you? Is Twitter just like a part of it's just like a diary and we're just along for the ride? Do you have thoughts on that? Why you're so willing to be open about the really hard things?
There are definitely a lot of things I keep to myself.
Okay. Okay. That's good to know.
I guess you're right.
Or maybe not.
I've had a hard time with it. But I try not to say anything that's like right now I want to kill myself, or like the kind of like meaner thoughts that I have sometimes that I'm like, stop being a jerk. Right. So I try to be like a responsible citizen while also being vulnerable. I think part of it just comes from being a writer. Maybe a large part of it. And the rest of it is maybe from like being a father and an adoptee. There are these three parts of my life in which I always have to be very vulnerable. And so it's not that it comes naturally. It's more like that I've taught myself that vulnerability is, even though it's kind of a societal no-no, is really important for kind of self-honesty and is a kind of basis of growth. I think it's the kind of basis of growth, right? Like you have to kind of, you have all these like shells or layers of protection. And if you actually want to change, I think you have to be able to shed those things first. Because otherwise you just kind of change within the shell and you still have the same kind of layers on the outside. So I've tried like really hard in my life to be a constantly changing and growing person. I mean, that, as far as I can tell, is the only thing you could call like a purpose for living. I mean, whether it's like practice for some afterlife or to like earn a place in the afterlife, or just like an experience, like a temporary experience, and you're reborn as something else, or like it's just one thing and how are you spending it? All of those questions seem to me to come down to, like, personally at least, constantly changing, constantly improving. My kids ask this too. They ask like, what? They've gotten so existential. Where my oldest one, who's 9, has gotten very existential. She'll ask me like, what? Why are we alive? And and so this is what I tell her. I tell her, like, we're alive to keep changing, to keep making ourselves better. What else would we do? I have no idea. But so that's all just a long way of saying I am vulnerable on Twitter because I want to be vulnerable in life. And I like Twitter much more when there's much less separation between Twitter and like our actual lives. It's one of the things I really hate about some of the other kind of social media platforms. I quit Facebook specifically because it was so fake there, or like so manufactured, that people kind of have these Facebook personas, and we have Twitter personas too, but the Facebook personas are like so actually different from real life. Like everybody has good news all the time, or like only the absolute worst news, right? Is the only time you ever get like even moderately bad news, it's like the worst, terrible news ever. And the only time you get other news, it's like, this great thing happened to me. My life is wonderful. my husband is perfect and it's my birthday today and my kids are like adorable little things. And I just couldn't stand that anymore. And what I really like about Twitter, like less and less because it is becoming like more and more like Facebook. But when I started like on Twitter a long, long time ago, like 2007 maybe, was Twitter around 2007,
Like when it started?
2008, 9? I don't know.
Yeah, it's close to there somewhere.
But at that time, there was no retweet button, which I think is like the main problem now. It's like a amplification instead of like a conversation. But it used to be just like people being sad and like people like talking about what was actually happening in their lives and then like having conversations with each other. And that's still how I use Twitter, even though it's clearly not the right way to use Twitter anymore. I'm still like living my 2009 Twitter life or whatever.
Well, good for you. I, for one, enjoy it. And I feel like I had a brief stint of a few years where I did use Twitter in that way. And now I've become a Twitter lurker, and I feel like I miss out on some really good conversations because I'm a lurker. But because you're like, do you really follow me? Oh, yes, I do. But I just don't reply to anything.
You just don't reply.
All right. Well, we're wrapping up, but something I really did want to ask you about, and before we do our recommended resources, is grief and fatherhood. And I think you may have tweeted this at some point, actually. I don't have the words in front of me, but it was some sense of you grew up without your birth mother, and now your children are growing up without their mother.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that? The other thing, just before you start, is in one of your columns for Catapult, I think it might have been the latest one, you talked about just adoption theme in your life and just thinking how am I going to be a father because I have this, piece in my life. And now you're the parent. Can you just share a little bit about that with us?
When my first kid was born, I had this like really intense fear that my own trauma would affect my daughter in ways and like traumatize her in ways that I wouldn't kind of realize, because it took me so long to realize my own trauma, which I think is fairly common for adoptees, maybe especially like of my age and older. So I was really afraid of just this kind of what had happened to me happening to her, just in a, even though it wasn't like exactly her trauma, as me like re-traumatizing her, not re-traumatizing her, but like passing the trauma on. And then she'd be like 25 and in therapy and just figuring out that I had ruined her life. And then I would, also not really know until then either. And I had like this really horrifying fear. In fact, like to see your doppelganger disappear, I started writing that out of this fear. And that's why Matt is like estranged from all of his family at the beginning and trying to figure out how to be a better person who can also be a better kind of family member and lover / beloved. I got, my wife would say at the time, said, like, I'm the one who's supposed to be depressed and you're the one who's depressed and it's really annoying and you need to stop. And so I started going to therapy at that time, like really seriously, and I was just kind of realizing so much about how affected by the parts of my life that I don't actually remember I still am. Just kind of my whole world was changing. I had this idea of the world that was based on nurture, and then I had a daughter who was like a complete human being, obviously, when she was born. But I really didn't think that was possible. For some reason, I thought of like a baby as like an egg, I guess. That it would just like, right, you warm it up and keep it at a certain temperature, and the whatever environment it is hatches it into this like child that actually has some kind of life and personality to it. But this is like I just these are the ways in which kind of our lived experience twists the ways that we think of what reality is. So I had this kind of like terrible fear of this, and I would look at these other kids who had grown up and think like, how did their parents do that? Like, how did they actually like live to be 12, right? Like, I couldn't even imagine my kid becoming like an older kid, my baby becoming an older kid. And then I lived life a little bit, and then my wife got pregnant with our second child and got really sick, and we thought it was all kind of pregnancy sickness. She gave birth to our son, and none of the sickness went away. So she was really sick the first time, and of course it just kind of went away, or at least like morphed into different kinds of sickness afterwards. And so we knew that something was wrong, and I think we were both really afraid of it being cancer at that time, but we weren't kind of facing that. And finally she was tested and found out that she did have cancer, and that because it had been sitting there so long, and she couldn't have been tested or had anything done because of especially because of the laws in Texas, which are all for the protection of the fetus and not at all for the protection of the mother. Because of all of that, we just didn't catch it even close to in time, and it had metastasized already. And so, people were really amazing and helped a lot. We ended up having to send Catherine to Korea because the treatment is actually much better for stomach cancer there. And even without insurance, the care is better there. Though if she had insurance, which she didn't because she was in America, but if she'd had insurance, it basically would have been free, and we would have ended up paying. We would have been in huge debt here in America, and probably even to the point where we couldn't really get the treatment that we needed. We couldn't even go. We were in Houston, where the largest cancer hospital in the world is, and we couldn't get into that hospital because our insurance would not cover that specific hospital. And we were on Obamacare, but whatever. So anyway, sorry, that was a detour into the shittiness of American healthcare. But she spent almost 2 years, or maybe a little over 2 years. Actually, yeah, a little over 2 years in treatment. And she seemed to be doing really well at the beginning. The doctors, it was miraculous, really, that when she got into the hospital, the doctors thought that she didn't really have a chance. And then she improved so much for the first 9 months or so. And then it all kind of came crashing down, and she died, and I was left with the kids. And all of that trauma all of that fear of traumatizing the kids with my trauma, it all came true, though it wasn't really me doing it anymore, right? But it was they have to experience the exact same trauma in a way, not the exact same trauma, but the same kind of trauma that I experienced. And I mean, the people, I think, have tried to be nice in saying that I'm kind of uniquely prepared to father them in that trauma. But I actually think, right, the thing about trauma is you're the least prepared to face it again. And so it's been really, I'm still even more terrified now maybe of the ways in which my kids will have to grow up with similar loss and similar kind of consequences on their emotional and mental well-being. And I'm actually not really prepared to help them that well. I mean, I do my best, but I'm also grieving and facing the same kind of thing. I tweeted recently this thing and I was thinking to myself, I spent my whole life doing that, right? I actually spent my whole life pining after Korean women I had lost, a whole lifetime wishing that I could be with my birth family, and specifically my birth mother, because, right, of the ways we symbolize it. And then I met my wife, and it seemed like my life had gotten so much better. I mean, it had gotten so much better, but also that in loving her, there was also a way for me in which to love, or at least learn to be Korean, love Korea, or be Korean in a way that I thought I had lost. And then she died, and now I don't think of my birth mother that often now, because I think of my wife constantly. And it's also another loss of Korea, right? My kids are losing their Korea. I mean, my son has already lost it, obviously, because he's 3. And my daughter is losing it, and she's really upset about it. And she can't really talk. They can't really talk to their relatives on my wife's side. And, just all the things that I lost, they're losing or have already lost now too. And I wish that I could give them those things, but obviously I can't. So, it is what it is.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And I appreciate the realness of your answer. I think we as a culture are just so terrible with grief and loss. And I mean, we talk about disenfranchised grief as adoptees and how we're not allowed to grieve our first losses, but to normalize, like, it sucks. It's hard. It's 2 years on. It still sucks. Like, I feel like that's really helpful for people to hear. Like, they're not alone. And, those who have also lost a partner and a loved one and are walking this with you can just know, like, okay, I don't have to be all sewn up already. Like, that's not, I might never be. I think it's really helpful for people to hear that. So thank you. Do you want to read your dedication?
Oh, sure. Yeah, so the book is dedicated to my kids, but also kind of with a note to my wife. It says, "To my kids, in loving memory of Nao Kyung," which is my wife's name, "Sarange bogo shippa," which means I love you, I miss you. And then there's another part of it that says "for us," which is me thinking about who I'm writing for and what my audience is.
Thank you. I just want to highly recommend you guys grab Disappear, Doppelganger, Disappear. It's really, I don't know how to describe it. I've seen it called absurdist fiction. I've seen it called a number of different things. And then, see, now I have a real hard copy that I dropped on my desk. I've heard you say that it's written in an East Asian structure. I don't know how to pronounce this. Kishin Tenketsu.
Oh, yeah. I actually don't know how to pronounce it, but I think it's Kisho Tenketsu.
Okay. So it's really different from books that I've read before. And it really takes you on a wild ride.
Yeah.
Totally. So I would really recommend you do that. And then once you've read it, Matthew has done some, there's a book club article on the book from the Rumpus that might answer some questions that you might have had lingering after you read it, like I did. And the other thing I want to recommend is this piece that's so powerful from Long Reads that you wrote, "To Grieve is to Carry Another Time." We've talked about it and actually recommended it before on the podcast. So I just want to re-up that while you're here. And then what I mentioned during the course of our interview was you have a column at Catapult now. And so make sure you're following Matthew over there as well, because somehow, I don't know, all the articles that you've written, somehow adoption has come up again and again.
I know, it's hard not to.
I know. What, this adoptee life? Come on.
Right.
So there's another place you can follow Matthew's essays and I don't know. I feel like your writing is so powerful and just like this theme of our interview, right? This vulnerability that you're willing to go there is just so critical for us to not stuff stuff down. That we're so good at stuffing stuff down our whole lives. And so I appreciate so much that you're willing to go there. Is there anything you want to tell us about your book before you do your recommended resource?
It's funny, I hope. I think that goes a long way, especially now. I've actually had a lot of readers say, I haven't been able to read anything during quarantine until this book, which I think is the best. I mean, I wish I had put that on the cover of the book.
That's totally a high compliment. The other thing I should say is I read it and then I also downloaded the audiobook because I wanted to hear that. And you didn't read it, but I think that's just because of pandemic times.
Yeah.
The narrator is so good. It's so well done. And
yeah, he is really good. Yeah.
So if you like listening, because you're listening to a podcast right now, the audiobook is really, really, really well done.
His name's Greg Chun. He's done a lot of video game voices too, which I think is really interesting.
Okay.
He's just does a really good job. I mean, I really, really, really wanted to do this book because it's so much kind of like in a voice that I think is fun to read aloud, and was like reading it aloud and having fun with it was actually a large goal of mine with the book. But then, of course, right, the pandemic happened and I couldn't get to a recording booth, so they had to hire somebody much better than me.
Well, I hope that you'll record it at some point because I love hearing it in people's voices, and then you get the intent that you had for your puns. Okay, will you share with us what you want to recommend, please?
Yeah, sure. So I want to recommend an anthology called Outsiders Within, writing on transracial adoption. And it's edited by Jane Jung Trenka, Sun Young Shin, and Julia Cheniere Opara. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, which I feel bad about. It's the book that I recommend to, we feel like I have now a bunch of adopted students who've kind of found me. I didn't know that they were there, but they have found me, and I have a little community together. And it's the book that I always recommend first because for me, it was a really huge door swinging open between kind of the life in my head and the kind of rest of the world that was there all the time, but was kind of covered in you could say like a veil of adoptee myth. And this kind of opens the door to truth and reality in a really amazing way. So I would highly recommend this anthology. Again, it's called Outsiders Within, and it's on University of Minnesota Press.
And I see they're just bringing it back to print again in December 2020. I just brought it up while you were talking. So that's awesome. Okay, thank you so much. Thank you for sharing that. Thank you for being so real with us. And I'd love for you to share where we can connect with you online.
So I'm on Twitter, of course, at Salis, my last name. And I have a website, which is just the kind of regular www.matthewsalisis.com. And you can find out more about the books and other things there. And I'm on Instagram too, I guess, though it's mostly like pictures of my kids when they allow me to put it up, because I ask them. So it's pictures that my kids approve, which is fun, I think. And that's my Instagram name or handle, whatever that thing is m.salisis. I'm very old now, I feel like. Like the kids, my students, I mean, not my actual kids, have all of these other things. I feel like I should be on TikTok or something. I actually think TikTok is probably pretty cool, but I don't even know how cool it is.
Okay, so I just turned 37, so we're near the same age-ish.
Yeah.
And I am addicted to TikTok. I don't make any, but I watch them. And man, if you want to zone out, that algorithm knows you. It gets to know you real fast, and it knows what you like. So if you have an addictive personality of any sort, do not recommend. But if you like videos of any kind, I mean, well, yeah, you can scroll for a long time.
I really love the, I don't know if you get these, but like the TikTok challenges from K-pop songs, where like the singer will just like do a simple dance for the first whatever seconds that you can be on TikTok, and then other people will copy them. It's just, I don't know why I like it so much, but it's very fun.
Oh boy, you could go down quite a rabbit hole of that, I'm sure. Thank you so much for chatting with me today, Matthew. I just wanted to remind you something we talk about here often is one big way you can be helpful to adoptee authors to ensure their books get in the hands of the most people is to review their books. And so wherever you like to buy your books, if you're an Amazon person, no shame here. Indie bookstore, if you buy books at indie bookstores, go to Goodreads, leave a 5-star review. And even if you just leave a 1-sentence comment of what you liked about the book or what you appreciate about the author, it's so helpful for them to get boosted up in the rankings. And so more people will find their work. So Matthew didn't ask me to say that. I really want I want to encourage you to support adoptee authors in whatever manner you can. And that is just, it's a free, easy way to do that. Even if you haven't read their work yet, give them a 5-star rating if you know you're going to enjoy their book. It's a big help. Okay, now, how do you win the signed copy of Matthew's book, Disappear, Doppelganger, Disappear? Just go over to our Instagram feed at Adoptees On, and there will be a post with a picture of his book, and you can just like the photo and give it a comment, and you'll be entered to win. And the dates for the entry, all that stuff will be right out there on the post. So on Instagram at Adoptees On is where you can enter to win a copy of Matthew's book. And we're so grateful that he was willing to sign and send that out for us. Thank you. Okay, so I just want to say another big thank you to all my monthly supporters of the podcast. It's because of you, this show goes on, and I'm so grateful for your generous support. If you want Adoptees On to continue, and if you think it's having an impact in the world and you want it to reach more adopted people, go to adopteeson.com/partner, and you can find out all the details of how to support the show and all the cool bonuses you get for whatever level of support is a right fit for you. Thank you so much, and thanks for listening. Let's talk again next Friday.